The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Mary Magdalene stayed outside the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she bent over into the tomb and saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken my Lord, and I do not know where they laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus there, but did not know it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" She thought it was the gardener, and said to him, "Sir, if you carried him away, tell me where you laid him, and I will take him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Stop holding on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them, I am going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and then reported what he had told her. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The resurrection appearance that the liturgy presents to us on Easter Tuesday is Matthew's account of the resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene. We have to see very, very beautifully, John's account, Matthew's account was yesterday. In John's account of the resurrection, he tells the story of how on the morning of the first Easter, Mary Magdalene discovers the tomb of Jesus is empty. So she runs off to Peter and to the disciple whom Jesus loved to report this troubling development, and that all that is left there is nothing of what they expected. So, you see that John immediately runs to the tomb with Peter. But since John perhaps was younger, he outruns Peter. He sees that the tomb is empty, and all that is left there are the burial cloths within which Jesus had been wrapped. And they are neatly folded, the Gospel says, and they were put to one side. That was the Gospel last Sunday. And then, because the disciple whom Jesus loved sees with the eyes of love, or better, he sees with the eyes of one who knows he is loved. He understands. He understands what it means. He saw and believed because he knew he was loved. He understands the resurrection with his eyes. Today's gospel continues last Sunday's story. We have to read the gospel, not chop. We have to read the gospel narrative as a whole. Today's gospel continues where Sunday's gospels left off. Mary Magdalene apparently returns to the tomb after Peter and John left. Mary returns and stayed outside weeping. In her grief and in her obsession to look for the Lord, she does not even recognize the angels sitting there. Imagine that. Her grief was so profound that She did not even recognize that there were celestial beings in the tomb sitting at the foot and sitting at the head of where Jesus' body laid. Neither does she recognize Jesus when he speaks to her himself. It was only when Jesus calls her by her name that she finally realized who he was. When somebody calls you by name and the person loves you, iba kaya ang tono? When somebody calls your name and galit, iba din ang tono. Jesus' tone must have been disarming, that she immediately realized who he was. John understood the resurrection with his eyes. Mary understood the resurrection with her ears. What does this all tell us? The days between the resurrection and the ascension are 40 days. And if you look at the accounts of the gospel, they were not fiesta days at all. They were not days of unadulterated joy for the first disciples. Yes, it was a time of joy, but also it was a time of considerable confusion. It was a time of despondency. It was a time of grief. Sometimes we think that just because Jesus is risen, it will be fiesta every day. But it is very clear in the Gospels. After the resurrection, it was a time of mixed emotions. They were overjoyed when they recognized the risen Lord. But most of the time, they were unable to recognize the new way Christ was present to them. They mistake him for a stranger on the bank of the Sea of Galilee. They mistake him for a fellow traveler. They mistake him for a gardener. Most of the time, they were not able to recognize the risen Lord and how he was present to them with what was happening around them. At one point, John even says, the disciples gave up completely, as John put it, that they went back to their former life. They became fishermen again. They went back to fishing. They went back to the sea. They were just lost. What does this tell us? They grasped the challenge later, that they needed to give up clinging to the way Jesus was present to them so that he could be present to them in a new way. And John gives this same lesson in his description of the encounter on Easter morning when Jesus tells Mary, "Stop clinging to me. Stop holding on to me. I have not yet ascended to my Father." My dear brothers and sisters, first this tells us that we have to be very realistic and that we have to change the ways we have formerly understood things. First, how do we understand holiness? How do we understand growth? How do we understand sin? Holiness. We think the holier we become, the clearer it becomes. Sorry, that's not the way it works. Sometimes we think the closer we get to God, the surer the direction is. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. Growth is not a straight line. And sometimes we associate growth with, oh, the virtues are all visible. I am becoming less and less inclined to sin. Oh, the fruits can be seen and I can appreciate that feeling of the Lord's closeness. This was not the way it was. Because growth is not only upward growth, fruits are visible, things are clear. No. In fact, they were despondent. They were grieving. They were giving up. Those are signs of growth. Those are signs of holiness. We think holiness has no detours. We think holiness, everything is clear. No. Growth is not only upward. Growth is downward. What do I mean? We put down deep roots. Yes, we struggle. But there is a change in the way I see my life. Therefore, not all those who stray get lost. In fact, many times, the detours of our lives are the most fruitful parts. Who says we will be free of doubts? We will be free of despondencies. We will be free of discouragement. That doesn't happen. When we look then at sin, when we talk about sin, what causes sin? Many times, we always want to overcome sin. So I have to love, I have to love, I have to love. I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. It shows here, what changes people is not when they love. What changes people is when they know they are loved. Iba kaya? Iba. Kung alam mong mahal ka, sooner or later, change comes. We are always talking about loving, about serving, about growing in holiness, blah, 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 blah. But we are putting the cart before the horse. John knew he was loved. That's why he understood with his eyes. Mary Magdalene knew she was loved. That's why she understood with her ears. Do you see how the Easter grace adapts? Men are more visual. I think most women are more auricular. God knows how to get the message across. So, this is the second thing. To love, to serve. Come on. Our vocation is to allow ourselves to be loved first. Then we will know how to love correctly. That is why people do not change. That is why they commit sin. Why? Because they are not convinced na mahal sila. Because kung convinced tayo that I am beloved of the Lord, transformation is almost something that follows immediately. I don't mean enseguida, at the moment, something of a process. And last, dear brothers and sisters, the 11th century French-German mystic, Hugo of Saint Victor, once famously said, "Love is the eye through which we see realities. When we see with love, including ourselves, mind you, we not only see straight, we don't only see clear-eyed, we also see with depth, we also see with meaning." I'd like to say, when we listen with love, we not only hear loud and clear, we listen with empathy. We listen with interiority. And the reverse is true. When you look at the Easter grace, it is only knowing that you are loved. And because you are loved, the Easter transformation begins its work. It's not about us. It's about us being loved. So, my dear brothers and sisters, it is not for some arbitrary reason that after Jesus rose from the dead, some could see him, some could not. Some could hear him, some could not. Some could recognize him, some could not. And who were the ones who could recognize him? Love is the eye. Those who knew they were loved, and those who experienced that love. Those searching for life and meaning through the eye of love, like Mary Magdalene searching for Jesus in the garden on that first Easter morning, like John the Beloved running to the tomb and seeing the folded burial cloths. They experience Easter. Any other kind of eye, and we are blind, dense in the face of life itself. We want to be transformed. Let us allow ourselves to be loved first.